Okay, thank you very much, Mariusz, and thank you all you are here listening to me at 2 p.m. I hope you like this conference and that we can have an interesting debate. Sorry for my English, I've been in France 5 months, so I will put some French in the presentation maybe, but I will try to do my best. Okay. The title of the presentation is Looking Heritage from Above, documenting and interpreting the northeastern Horn of Africa's heritage using field service, excavation, and especially remote sensing, which is very descriptive of what I'm doing in my PhD. Okay, the main goal is what I'm telling you in the title of the presentation, but also is how this could help us to understand nomadic archaeology, nomadic societies in the Horn of Africa. Okay, a little bit about the goals and the task of these presentations and the different parts. The first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the geopolitical context of my PhD and the context in which the Spanish archaeological mission in the Horn has been working. Okay, a brief introduction about our work in the Horn of Africa, but also I will talk about the ecological and cultural context in the Horn of Africa, the different landscapes that we have there, in which all the archaeological record is placed, but also all the process I've been doing in the PhD, mapping the Horn's heritage from the space, from field service, from excavation, all in all to understand nomadic material culture, nomadic funerary architecture, and to understand nomadic societies. That's the goal of my PhD, that's the goal of the presentation at the end. And also the last part, I would like to have a debate with you, try to look forward from my PhD and how we can use the data, how we can use that methodology, if you think it could be applied to other areas, etc. Okay, about the geopolitical context. Where do we work in the Horn of Africa? Well, we work in 4 or 5 different countries. The first one is Djibouti, which is an ancient French colony, was an French colony, Somaliland, that was a British colony, Ethiopia, but also Somaliland and Puntland. Our goal working here is avoid these actual boundaries, these colonial frontiers between different countries in the Horn, and try to do a more global study without considering encroaching us in these colonial boundaries. About the project and the archaeology we do in the field. I'm part of a big team from the Spanish government. We are part of the CSIC, which is the National Research Council of Spain, and we work in Santiago de Compostela in the north. That's our base. And from there, Alfredo González Rival and Jorge de Torres managed to have some projects first in Somaliland. We work in Somaliland from 2017 to 2020. Then we have a period of change because we have some problems in Somaliland, so we had to change the project. And in 2021, we began to work in Djibouti, and we are currently based right there. We are very good working with the people there. I hope in the future we will be able to return to Somaliland and to work with the people there. Of course, we are also in Ethiopia. Jorge's team began to work there the last year. And in the future, we are open to open the project to Puntland and more parts of the Djibouti, and of course, Somalia. We are in contact with archaeologists there that are doing their own projects, digging and excavating and studying some ancient cities. So we are in close contact with them, and we know that we can be able to work there. So in the future, that's a possibility. About Somaliland, well, Somaliland is the place where we did the majority of our work. We dig a lot of archaeological sites, including his, which is a port of trade from the 1st century to the 7th century AD, medieval sites and ports like Bulahar, medieval cities like Fardousa, fairs and commercial hubs like Villogure, other medieval fairs like Menderabas, which is located in the northern coast of Somaliland. The majority of the places we have been were in the central part, but also some forts, medieval forts. There is a whole lot of archaeological sites, a variety of archaeological sites that we have been working there in Somaliland. And in Djibouti, of course, we have the same things. We have a very rich mosaic of archaeological sites. For example, we have cities like Handoga, but we have ports of some cairn fields like Dasbillo, Abu Yusuf also. We have medieval fairs, of course, and the good thing is very, very well preserved. The place is very arid, so the materials are very well preserved. It's easy to work there. But in the Horn, there are challenges and possibilities of work. One of the good things is that there is not a lot of bureaucracy to deal with. And normally you don't have to ask for a lot of permissions to work in a city, in an archaeological site. You just need the main permission, the main contract with the different entities. For example, in Somaliland is the Ministry of Tourism, and in Djibouti is the Centre d'études and recherche. It's like a version of the CSIC, of the Spanish National Research Council, but in Djibouti. And you don't have to do a lot of bureaucracy. You just have to get the general permission, and you can theoretically work in all the country. You of course have to deal with the local authorities, but in that sense, is very good. Also, there is a lack of intense research, with the exception of Djibouti, where we have a lot of French teams working. So you have at the end an area which is the two sides, Portugal, it's a very big country like Somaliland, and with nearly nothing done. There is a lot of opportunity to work. There is a lot of space for a lot of teams to work there. And from Africa, from the Horn of Africa, Somalis, Ethiopians, but also European teams. And there is a lot of opportunities to train and work with local researchers, and those are very, very interesting, and interested in their history, in recuperate and study more from a more scientific point of view their history. And also with the diaspora community from England, from Sweden, from France, that is very interested in knowing more about their roots in their countries. But there are also a lot of challenges. For example, there is not a well-established cultural heritage management institutions, and the authority they have is not a lot. In maybe in the capital, yes, but when we are going to the field, it's very difficult. It's a completely different picture, because there is a lot of sacking. Their authority is not everywhere. They are not able to pay salaries for all the people. So it's very difficult. And also stability. There is stability in Djibouti and in Somaliland, of course, but for example, in Somalia, it's very difficult to work due to the presence, for example, of Al-Shabaab in the north, but also in the frontier between Somaliland and Puntland, where we have an armed conflict right now, so we cannot work there. About the ecology and geography of the Horn, of the northeastern Horn. Well, I used to say that this is a region with a very, very good and a great diversity of spaces. And I use as a metaphor this satellite image I have over here. And normally when I show up this image to the people, they think that this is mainly a desert, that there is nothing here. But when we took a deeper look into each area, into each particular area, it's a completely different picture. It's a picture of a great diversity. We have deserts, we have high mountains, we have plains, we have salt lakes, we have humid mountains, we have savannas. There is a lot of diversity here, and this is reflected also in the archaeological heritage we have here. Also, it's very important to say that here populations, the movement of the population, the location of the cities, the location of the population, and their economy are very marked by the seasonality. And seasonality is marked by the intermittent deluge that we have here for the rains, because There is not rain all over the year. The seasons are very marked. There's a very big difference here from Europe. We have two different seasons, rainy season and dry season. And normally that has been influencing the population all over the time because they have to move from different seasonal water courses, and their economy is based in there. And about their history, a brief history. What do we know from the Horn of Africa, from this part of the Horn of Africa? Well, actually, we know a lot, but not too much at the same time. We know something about the Paleolithic part of about the era of the hunter and gatherers here, but normally we are dealing with very big time spans. For example, we know, for example, that the Neolithic was in the 5000 BC, in the 3000, between the 5000 and the 3000 BC, but it's a very big period of time. We don't know how it begins, how it ends. We know that this is the Neolithic was a very different period that compared with the one I was talking before. Was a very humid period, and then we have an dry period from the 1800 BC onwards. And then we begin to have more data about this area, especially from the written sources. For example, from the Roman conquest of Egypt onwards, we begin to have Roman historians, Persian historians that are referencing, that are writing about this part of the Horn of Africa. Not a lot, but we have some texts. For example, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is very famous, and I'm sure the majority of you know the document. Well, it was written in the 1st century AD, and it's referring to the populations that were in this area as the Moshopagoi, the people who eat calf. So we can say that during this time they were pastoralists, and we have more data in this kind of written sources about them. We know that the Islamization in this part of Africa was very, very late. It was in the 11th century, and the Muslim conquest of Egypt was in the 646. So it was very, very late. Then written Islamic sources are not a lot. There is not a lot of Islamic sources, and it's very interesting to say that, for example, the Iberian Peninsula, which is very much far away from Arabia than Somaliland and the northeastern Horn of Africa, was Islamicized earlier than this part. And then we have during the Islamization period, a period of great states, of great sultanates, and we know these sultanates thanks to the Ethiopian written sources, a period of little sultanates that we know a lot from the Portuguese sources, from the colonial sources, and then the European colonialism from the 19th century to the 20th century. But what do we find when we are going to the northeastern Horn of Africa, when we are going to Djibouti, when we are going to Somaliland and to Somalia? Well, it's a very arid place in general with all this diversity, but it's very arid. And what we find is a very big cemetery. It's full of tombs. It's full of tombs everywhere. So you can go to different places. You can go to the sea. You can go to the inner part of the country, to the savannas, and you will find in an horizontal stratigraphy assemblage in palimpsests all different things. We have Islamic tombs, like for example this one over here, but sharing a space at the same level with these things over here that are pre-Islamic cairns. And this is very, very common. It's an horizontal stratigraphy. There is a kind of a messy landscape, but in this messy landscape, there is a chaotic order and there is a sense and that is my goal, to understand this chaotic order, put some order, and understand all these palimpsests, this horizontal stratigraphy. And this kind of chaotic order is where my personal project begins. That's what I call Pablo's personal project, which is my PhD, and is understanding all this northeastern Horn of Africa nomadic architecture, all this landscape, all these palimpsests. Why are assembled like that? How were they built? How this can help us at the end to understand nomadic populations. And of course, from a long-term perspective, since the Neolithic to the 19th century. Why? Because the French team here in Djibouti has been studying the Neolithic a lot, and I want to, instead of giving a very precise view of a part of the period of from the, for example, late antiquity, I want to give like a more general view, and then let other scholars to be more specific. Well, about the nomadic funerary architecture, about the nomadic material culture, what do we have here? This is one of the challenges because we are trying to study nomads, but when we go to the nomadic material culture, it's the majority of the things we found are perishable materials, and now they are including plastic and rocks and rock huts and metal. But during the 19th century, during the 20th century, what the majority of the things they have were fibers, the huts, the daily things that were made of hide, they were made of fibers, and there was a scarcity of pottery. So when we go to these nomadic settlements, it's very difficult to find something because there is not a lot and they move. So when we go to these places, this is a nomadic hut in Djibouti. When they move to the wadi, when the rain comes, well, they transport the whole thing, and now we can document, for example, the metal sheets. We can document the rocks, but those were not part of the ancient nomadic material culture. On the other hand, what we have a lot, it's nomadic funerary architecture, are cairns, are tombs, because they are made of rock and that are not meant to be transported. In this case, we have, for example, here, this is a drawing made by Georges Reboal, a French archaeologist, a French explorer. He went to Somaliland and Somalia, and he just draw tombs. And there's a reason, because they are scattered everywhere, and there is a carpet of tombs. They are ubiquitous to all the country. And departing from this carpet of stones, this carpet of tombs, I began to document all this when I first began my PhD. My first campaign in Somaliland was in 2020. And the first thing we did when we were in the field, we were surveying, we were digging some of these tombs, trying to get materials to date these tombs. And then we try to locate these sites in Google Earth, in Google Maps, trying to see if the things we saw in the field were the same, and checking all these places if we can see the same things from the field and thanks to satellite imageries. And I begin this project of surveying the horn from the space, trying to look for the biggest concentrations of freely available images and the concentration of archaeological sites, and try to see where these archaeological sites are. There is a very, very good thing that there is a lack of thick vegetation, for example, the one we have here in France or in Poland in Central Europe. So you can see the things very, very good. And there is a very good contrast between the structure, which are black, those are blacks from made of basalt stone, and the ground, which is it's very sandy. So structures like tumulus, mosques, Islamic tombs are pretty visible. And that was one of the first things I did, for example, with the ancient port of His, which was documented in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And I tried to saw if all these ports, if all these places that were mentioned in Ptolemy geography, in Strabo, in Pliny, in the Periplus, were located exactly in the sites that were described, and thanks to satellite imagery. And some of the places we were able to visit it, and it was very good to see that you can recognize and see in the field the same things. And suddenly, in 2020, as COVID came, I was waiting for my grant to begin my PhD, and I have a lot of time to think. I have a lot of time to read bibliography. I have a lot of time to think how I was going to define my PhD, the methodology. And I said, okay, I think the methodology of looking for the site, studying the sites in the field and looking for them and organize them in thanks to satellite imagery, to surveys, to photo interpretation, it's a good methodology. So I will begin to map all the sites that we have been able to visit and compare it with the bibliography. And one of my first conclusion was that there is a lot of things, a lot of names for the funerary architecture, for the tumulus. Sometimes we have three names in the bibliography in the same journals for the same thing. For example, I put you the example that rectilinear cairn is called rectilinear cairn by Davis, but also a rectilinear platform, but also enclosed platforms. So scholars are referring to the same things, but with different names. I think one of the good points of my PhD is give a name and give homogeneity and give some order to these classifications. The first thing I said, okay, what do we have to do first to understand this long period of time, to understand in a wide view nomadic funerary architecture? Well, the first thing I have to do is do a relative typology, which is something I promised myself during my career I will not do, but at the end I finished in doing it. I began to create a typology and combine all this type of funerary architecture I defined in the field, thanks to the bibliography, but thanks also to satellite imagery, and combine all this with pottery, radiocarbon date we obtain from the field. So at the end, it's a multiple approach. To understand this funerary architecture in a wide range, I, of course, use bibliography of different areas, and I try to do a global covering of different geographical areas, of different ecologies, of different distribution of clans, and of course, different countries, because I want to avoid a more national-based studies. So I define a total of 18 transits. I begin to map all these funerary architecture in all these transits. Some of them we were able to go, and I think the half of them we were unable. And I begin to map all this funerary architecture and create the typology. I define this process by trying to be as simply as I can and be adaptable to all different kind of contexts. And I began to map systematically all these transits I told you. Okay, first of all, I was mapping by group. I tried to see in the satellite imagery, for example, here, there is a big group of structures. For example, we have here, 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 and I put a point in one of each groups. But at the end, I realized that we cannot talk in more historical definition of archaeological sites. We cannot define like close archaeological sites all these points. In fact, we have a more dispersed kind of context of what is an archaeological sites, because there are tumulus, there are tombs, there are mosques everywhere, but everywhere in the Horn. So at the end, I decided to put an individual point per each structure and not talk about archaeological sites, but different structures and different sites. And I was going to talk about the methodology a little bit, because I know some, like Mariusz, some of you work in Sudan or you work in Egypt. So maybe you can apply the same methodologies to your context. I put you here an example of an archaeological site in Somaliland, which is called Jidi, which means in Somali, the crossroad, literally. And here you can see some of the things, for example, some points over here. As I told you, it's very easy to distinguish them thanks to the contrast. And first, what I did is locate a point, for example, this archaeological site. Okay, the main concentration is here. And then I begin to see where the structures are located. Okay, then I set a scale, I set the proper image. I choose, okay. Here it is. I chose an historical image. This one is from 2015. I set a scale, 97 meters, and I set the camera height. Because I said, okay, at this height, at this scale, and with this historical image, I can see the majority of the things. For example, here is Cairns, here is another, this is a mosque. So at this height, I can able to see the majority of the things. You can have here the signals. The red are the Islamic ones. And then I define an area, and I began to do different transects. I began to work with the camera at the height I told you, and I began to map every single point I have like a transect in all the area to define how many structures I have. This is the final result with temporary denominations. For example, BM means burial mound with a ring, burial mound with a ring and a mosque. They are very, very descriptive and they were temporal. But the important thing is I set a scale, I do transect, I am being very, very systematical about the process, and I document every single thing I found. This is also very important because at the same time I was mapping, I realized that there is a lot of things that I wasn't able to find in the bibliography. There is a lot of things I wasn't able to see when I went to the field. So I need to create temporary names. Then I had to change these temporary names, create new denomination to do this mapping more and more systematically, and trying to see if I can apply these denominations when I go to the field and if other scholars can apply it and be very, very neutral. So at the end, I finished in creating a language to describe all these things in the field, but also thanks to serve in satellite imagery. A new denomination based in programming language with initials and acronyms, and I made a dictionary, and it's based simply in you describe things from outside, from inside to the outside. For example, in this case, this is a cairn which has been sacked. There is a cairn inside, then we have an outside ring, then we have another ring, and then we have an appendix, which is right here. And you describe it in the same way you find it. So when you go to the field, you can check if every single one of these components that are reflected in the dictionary are present or not, and you can change it. So it's very adaptable. And with all these names, with all these denomination, I begin to create the typology and I begin to modify previous denominations. I organize a typology in 4 categories: type, group, variable, and subvariable. I didn't want to be very, very specific and use, for example, denominations that we use in and names we have in the classical typologies of Terra Sigillata, for example. I want to be very descriptive and combine, for example, this programming language. For example, in this case, came with a platform with type 1, and I have the description and other kind of denominations to search for it in the tables. And you can modify everything. It's meant to be modified. And after the mapping comes the serious stuff. We went to all these areas. I tried to map, and we tried to see if the things we saw in the mapping and things we saw in the field were the same things. And we did the same this thing in different places in Djibouti, in the regions of the Hill and Obok, and that meant visiting a huge quantity of sites. Correct the things, checking if each point is correct. Each point I put in the GIS in Google Earth was correct. Try to take another point with the GPS. Try to take measures. Sometimes we used 3D to get a better registration. In other times, I just have to do a quick drawing, a quick design, and go on because we had no time, because we have to dig at the same time I was registering all this. And the final result is I map 1,000 667 structures, and the area in map was 423 thousand square kilometers covered. And for all this area, I applied the complete typology. How much time to do it? Well, actually, it was not too much because what I told you, being systematic, I don't think I spent more than a year doing this because everything was pretty visible. The trick is being systematic. And this is more or less the result. If you see it from the space, all these clusters of structures. In reality, there are more, but there's a very dense cloud over here. And this is the whole typology. There are a total of 18 types of things, from face cairns, alignments, buildings. And one of the good things is the main type, the type that defines the lower part. It has been documented by bibliography, by us in the field. So in that sense, the 18 types are very well defined, and you can apply to all these areas without modifying too much. When we are going down, well, it's more difficult to have the same thing in the field, but we can apply it, and we found that the things we documented in aerial images are mainly the same. Also, I did the same with colonial maps. I was able to use German colonial maps, French colonial maps, British, and even from a map from a Romanian hunter. And thanks to satellite images and the location of the paths and the location of the cairns, I was able to put and draw all these trade routes and all these caravan routes. And it was also pretty easy. We were able to document the majority of the trading routes that were located in the northeastern Horn of Africa in the 19th century. And I'm now in the process of using all these routes to see if there is a relation between the structures, the funerary structures that I have been documented, and these trade routes. Some preliminary observations that we saw combining all this mapping from the space. Well, one of the things we saw and we corroborated from the field, it was that there are some areas that are completely empty and others that are full of structures, that are full of funerary structures. And well, one of the options was, okay, they are not building here funerary structure because they have no rocks, but they have rocks over here. So there is a pattern in the location. And when we use a kernel density analysis to check the location of the funerary structures, we were able to see that they are, of course, these areas that are completely open. And the areas that are more close to the mountains and the areas that are close to the rivers are full of these funerary structures. So that could help us to understand nomadic seasonal movements. And talking about precision and the problems of the mappings, of course, they are problems. There are a lot of problems, and the only way to see how things really are is in the field. And as I told you at the beginning of the presentation, I couldn't go to all the areas. And for example, in Somalia, in this area over here, I will say it's impossible to go. It's a process, it's a work that all the teams has to do, and especially local teams have to do. But also, it's important to recognize that it is also easy to forget and see many things when you are in the field. When you are in the field, a cairn that are very visible from the space is just a pile of stones, and everything is black. So you are able to differentiate things thanks to the shade, thanks to other things, other variables. So both things, I believe, are complementary. But at the end, it will be impossible for a team to corroborate each one of the structure in a whole life. So I believe it is a collective work, and many things have to be corrected, but it's a thing that we have to do collectively with all the people, local people, other people from Europe. And just to give you a view from the size, the area I covered is roughly the size of Poland. So there is a lot of space there. I was able to visit some of these places in Djibouti, in Somaliland, but as I told you, there is a more collective, more wide approach. And one of the interesting things I saw is there is a very big homogeneity in all this area. The tombs that we found here are the same in this area over here and this area over here. For example, the shape of the cairn is common in all these areas and beyond the Horn of Africa. And it was very interesting that when we put the location of all this cairn, the distribution, and we combined it with bibliography, we were able to see that the pastoralist distribution in the Horn of Africa and the cairn distribution roughly is the same. For example, in these areas of Kenya are the sites of Kokumatakore and places that were excavated by Paul Lane and other scholars. There are the same things that we find in Somaliland. And for example, here there is an open area which corresponds with more high areas. So we can say that these cairns, this kind of funerary architecture are more related with nomadic pastoralists, and especially define the lower areas of the Horn of Africa. From the Horn and beyond, to check if this kind of mapping was adequate to the area I was studying, I checked with other places, with other regions of the whole continent. For example, in this case, in the Sahara, if I can see the same things, and especially if I can see the same thing in sites that different colleagues are studying. For example, here in Sudan, I collaborate with Cornelia in the site of Musawarat, and I did an aerial survey of the area close to Musawarat, and we were able to see the same things we are seeing in the Horn. So the methodology is very diverse, and you can apply to other contexts. For example, in this case is in Sudan, in the area of Darfur, and I was able to map in the same way I map in Somaliland and in Djibouti all this funerary architecture of the pastoralist. But what more? I don't want to talk just about the methodology, about all these points. I want to talk about what all these points, what all these structures means, because that's the important things. That's the main goal of the PhD. That my main goal of my research and of the team is. The goal is to understand nomadic funerary architecture and by extension understand nomadic society, because as I told you, the majority of the things we have are funerary sites, not living spaces, with some exceptions like Handoga or some medieval cities. But the majority of the things we have are funerary architecture. So I think what we have to use here is a deconstructive analysis. We have to go from general, from this big mapping, to a more particular point of view, and try to get every site, all these palimpsests, and deconstruct all these palimpsests using all these methodologies I told you, with GIS, with aerial images, but also thanks to pottery, thanks to excavation. And this is one of the work I have been doing parallel to all this mapping. For example, we have this image with all the mapping I did with all these points. There is a lot of noise, and in reality, you are not able to see a lot of things here. You can see open spaces with no funerary architecture, but we have to get a little bit far away from all these forests to see the whole picture. For example, one of the things I use is kernel analysis and apply to each type of the typology. And we were able to see that some structures that are oriented astronomically are located in some of the places in IMAP. And we can talk about some regional trends in funerary architecture. Maybe that meant some specific groups, some clans that were here. We don't know, but we can see that there is a lot of variability in the different areas. And we can say other things. For example, when we isolate the Islamic tombs with the ring, and we put the distribution in a kernel analysis, we were able to see that not all the places in the areas I mapped have the same things. For example, the east part of the country has very, very little very little of these tombs. But when we go to the west part, the part where the majority of the sultanates were located, the first part to be Islamicized, we begin to see the great amount of these Islamic tombs. So that could help us also, this mapping, to understand how Islam spread in the Horn of Africa. But I will begin with a little bit of history about what do we have to give you a very complete picture of what I'm studying. Well, the first thing we have before pastoralism, before nomadism, was a Neolithic period from the 5000 to the 3000 BC, which is a humid phase. This phase I'm not focusing in. It has been more worked by the French. Here, you have a lot of archaeological sites here. For example, the main one is Antakari 3, which is being studied by Jesse Collier. It's a funerary site, of course, and it's a very, very big communal site. It's a flat cairn, like the one we have here. This is Antakari 3. And it has dozens of meters, and it's a communal grave. They have found around 150 tombs of women, of children, and men, all located in the same level in an horizontal way. So they open the tomb and regularly, and they begin to bury more and more and more people there. The things that they have, well, the majority of things are local pottery or nearly nothing of funerary mobilia. Very, very, very few goods. As I told you, it's a collective, and during this period in Neolithic was a humid phase, was a phase that was defined of a more similar climate than the one we have here in the Horn of Africa. We have a climate that is more close to the one we have in the Nile River, the one we have in South Sudan. It was defined by a mixed economy of hunters, gatherers, but also farmers. We know that they were cattle herders, and this is reflected also in the rock art that we found here. We have a lot of cattle. The majority of things are cattle, not camels, not anything, just cattle. Well, this phase is defined by plate tombs, and of course they are not very, very visible. But then we have a period that we don't know a lot what happened. We know that from the 1800 BC, it began a drier phase in the Horn of Africa, and these kind of plate tombs begin to disappear. We have instead these kind of tombs, which are more individual, like this. They are still preserving some elements of the first tombs, like for example these rings, but they are individuals. And one of the most important things is that they don't have this local pottery. So we think that this is the transit to nomadism, thanks to this climate change, thanks to the beginning of this drier phase. But we don't know a lot about this period. We weren't able to work a lot. What we know is in the 1st century BC, in the 2nd century BC, they are nomads, thanks to the written sources. They are pastoralists, and they move. That's one of the things we know for sure. And during this period of time, we have a completely different picture than the one we have before. We don't have plate tombs, we don't have collective tombs. During this time, what we have are these huge cairns. For example, this one is in Das Billo, and the diameter is 40 meters, is 15 meters tall, which is a lot of stone. There are tons and tons of basalt stone piled here. And one of the important things here is that they are they include foreign goods. They are individual tombs, and the individual who is buried inside the tomb is accompanied with pottery from Rome, from pottery from the Sassanid Empire. And in one of the cairns, which was of the very similar typology, we were able to find a Syrian Roman glass from the 4th century BC. AD, sorry. During this time, there is a lot of commerce. We know that from the written sources. We know that from this time is the first arrival of camels. We have the first camel documented in Somaliland in the 3rd century AD. So they begin to establish all these commercial routes, all these trade routes. And of course, the boom of commerce is reflected in each tomb. For example, this one is subadult in the port of His, and she was accompanied with this Roman glass jar. But in some of the cases, we were able to find some Axumite jars and also some materials, some pendants that were also found in the royal necropolis of Axum. So these people are consuming the same things, and maybe they are involved in the same dynamics of the Ethiopian highlands. Other very interesting thing is that these places are not located randomly. They are located in close to the rivers, at the mouth, at the beginning, at the entrance of the valleys, and also in the crossroads of the different wadis, which are seasonal during this time. So they have to fight for the water. One of these cairns, one of these sites is the site of Gistir, in which we have a tumulus of 60 meters. Here you can see more or less the scale thanks to the cars. The problem, it was sacked, and maybe we have to imagine the cairn like something like this. We were able to find some pottery from Mesopotamia, Sassanid pottery from the 6th century. We talked with the people there, and they told us that they brought caterpillar and other heavy machinery to dig the whole thing because they found gold. So we know more or less that these kind of cairns are meant for the royalty, and they are buried with very, very prizeful materials. But we have the same in other regions. For example, in the site of Abu Yusuf, we were able to dig one of the cairns, and in that cairn that was sacked, of course, we found the same thing. We found pottery from Mesopotamia. This site is located as well in a gathering place for the nomads, in a crossroad, but also in a wadi crossing. What I think here, it's we are witnessing a global phenomena. I think we are documenting the same things. Julian Cooper and the team from the PCMA are documenting in Sudan, but also in the deserts of Egypt with the Blemish. And for example, we have the same thing, for example, in the necropolis of Khor-Nur, that we have these big cairns, this reference in the written sources to these nomadic elites. And we have the same things in Algeria, for example, in the tomb of Tinginan. It's a very, very big tomb located in the central Sahara, where the archaeologists in the 30s were able to find a lot of Roman materials, late Roman material, ceramics from Tunisia, of course. And I think we're during this period from the 3rd to the 6th centuries to the 7th centuries, we are witnessing a process of creation of nomadic elites in the peripheries of these biggest states, for example, the Sassanid state and the Roman states in the Sahara, but also in Sudan, in Egypt, and in the Horn of Africa. Elites that their power were based in commerce with Roman, within the Sassanid Empire, and they were able to create something that was similar to, we can define like a nomadic state. In this case, we can also talk about nomadic territoriality, because all these care are not located randomly. They are located close to the wadis in a very, very visible position. You can see it from kilometers away. Normally, the biggest cairn is located close to the river. There is an association between water and these big cairns. And also, it will be very, very interesting to see this when it was built, because it was not black, but white completely. So it will be, it would have been very contrastful with the plain. And then we have a period of change, but also of continuities that began in the 9th century to the 13th century AD. We have the disappearance of these big cairns of dozens of meters. The cairns begin to be little and little and little and little, and with less goods inside the tomb. In some cases, the platform that we had before transformed into a ring. And this kind of ring is the one that we are able to see in some of the early Islamic tombs in the Horn of Africa. Some of them are still very, very megalithic or very monumental, like this one over here. And this happened all around the 9th to the 13th century, where we believe that previous beliefs, pre-Islamic beliefs, were related and were in the same space with the new belief, with the new Islamic beliefs. And this is reflected also in the funerary architecture. So we can talk about changes, but we can talk about continuities, of course. About Islamic times, we have a change. Okay, we can have new funerary trends from these big cairns. Now we have the Islamic rite tombs, and this new rite is very defined by little tombs with no goods inside the tomb, and the tombs are arranged in cemeteries. Normally, they are accompanied by all the tombs, and they are not very, very individual. And we can say that there is a democratization of the burial practices compared with the things we had before, because during the pre-Islamic times, we believe that only these big men were the ones that were buried in these monumental cairns. But then after the Islamic times, this thing is very democratic, because we are able to see and differentiate tombs from men, but tombs from the women, but also tombs from the children. That's something we weren't able to see before. We were able to see these things during the Neolithic. So we have a change to from a more vertical society to a more horizontal society, and this is reflected in the funerary architecture. And then, well, in the Islamic times, we can also determine, as I told you, how the Islam entering the Horn of Africa and distribute in the Horn of Africa, thanks to all the distribution and the location of the mosques, for example. And of course, we can say that we can document the extension of some of these sultanates from the 12th to the 17th century, thanks to funerary architecture. For example, there is a big discussion between Somali scholars about the extension of the Sultanate of Adal. For example, I think we can use even this funerary architecture, these mosques, to locate how was the extension and the influence of this sultanate, which was linked to Islam, directly to Islam. And for example, we can see that, for example, is located in the west part of the Horn of Africa, but not in the east. And if we compare the Islamic times with the pre-Islamic times, we can see that during this time we can document, thanks to the distribution of the funerary architecture, two kinds of landscape. We can talk about the centripetal landscape, which is defined by these big cairns, and points in the landscape that correspond with crossroads, points where the wadis are wider, and there is not a lot of these cairns, and there are very, very little. So that means that not all the society was being buried during this time. And then during the Islamic times, if we compare the quantity of tombs, the quantity of mosques with the one we had before, and it's completely different. There is a whole explosion of funerary trends. I think there is a more democratization. The tombs are located everywhere, from wadis to open plain. They are completely everywhere. So we can say that there is more centrifugal trend, and there is not a lot of competition if we compare it with the previous times. And what's more, okay, the main conclusion of all this study, of all this mapping, of all these points and the PhD, is we can talk about a full circle. In a full circle in which funerary architecture is a direct metaphor of each nomadic society, and we are able to study each kind of pastoralist society, more or less thanks to the funerary architecture and the materials we found inside, of course. But from the outside view, from the outside shape of the tombs, we are able to identify what kind of society we have. First, we have a society which is more horizontal and is reflected in the funerary architecture, is reflected in these plate cairns, in the cairns we have in the Neolithic, with hundreds of tombs and that includes men, women, children. And then from the climate change in the 1800, and especially the arrival of very important international commerce from Rome and from the Sassanid Empire, we have more vertical society that is reflected in the tumulus. Tumulus that are individual with grave goods. We know that not everyone in the society was able to bury themselves here. Then the tombs began to reduce in size until we arrived to the Islamic times, where we begin to have a more horizontal kind of model where we have cemeteries. Each tomb is individual, but we have no grave goods, and women, children, men are buried at the same level. And just this is the end of the presentation. I want to talk a little bit more about the future. So what to do about all of this, with all this methodology, with all these things I have been telling you in the future? Well, one of my goals of my PhD is to serve as a model for future studies in the Horn, but in other arid regions, in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Chad. If they can use my model, my methodology, okay, I'm glad they can use it and try to see if we can see the same things, try to correct the methodology, if we can apply a better one. That's the first point, but also try to apply the typology and the dictionary I made to other areas to see if we can apply the same things, if we cannot, if we are seeing the same things. For example, in Sudan, I believe the majority of the cairns, for example, that Julian Cooper has been studied are flat, and in the Horn of Africa during the same time is a completely opposite thing. And of course, try to share all this data with all the teams to correct all this denomination, to correct all these archaeological sites, and to be more and more and more precise. I would like to work in the future, I told Mariusz, with artificial intelligence and try to use the sample, this big sample I made, to work with artificial intelligence and try to see if the artificial intelligence can see the same things I saw and apply it to other areas. For example, in Sudan, in Egypt, to avoid all the work that I did manually and to make it as for researchers, make it as more easy to understand, to document, and of course to preserve the archaeological heritage of these regions that are in danger of looting and sacking. I would like to construct also archaeological databases in the future to be and make these archaeological databases, for example, open. You have the Map in Arabia project that is completely open, but this is a very important challenge because, as I told you at the beginning of the presentation, there are not a lot of institutions, well-established institutions in these areas, in Somaliland, in Djibouti, and there is a lot of sacking, there is a lot of looting. So how we can do this? How we are able to share this data, make it open, and prevent all this sacking? Well, it's very difficult. I think it's something that has to be along with the authorities of this country. But I would like to know your opinion, how you manage with this situation in Sudan, in Ethiopia, or in Eritrea, or in Egypt, for example. And just this, I just want to tell you how thankful I am of being here, having the opportunity to share my PhD. Sorry for the connection. I think in some moments was very, very bad, but thank you for listening to me, and I will be very, very glad to see and to hear your comments. Thank you so much.